Thank you, Jasmine. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of our webinar today. We are so excited and always honored to have such a great partnership and to be able to work with Future Ed at Georgetown University and the Education Council. Both of them are located in Washington, D.C. We're always excited when we get to work with great partners, and we've been very lucky that we've gotten to do that with both of these groups for over a period of time. For SREB, if you're not familiar with us, the Southern Regional Education Board is based in Atlanta. In short, we are an interstate compact with our 16 southern states, where we work, as I like to say, pre-K to gray. We work from K-12 all the way through the workforce and provide actually a lot of professional development throughout the entire country. So our work, which is really centered on improving the economy of the South through education, one of our primary foci have become this issue of teacher shortages. You're going to hear from Megan Boren in just a few minutes. She's worked with leaders in 4 states around what we call the human capital roundtables. The reality is that we have recognized at SREB, and our states have really been screaming for help, that we have to address the teacher shortages and really elevate the teaching profession in each state. Mostly we've done our work in areas like North Carolina, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Alabama in regard to this, but we continually work to support all of our states and provide them more information around the teacher profession itself. For us, this is not just an education issue. This is an actual workforce issue. Without great teachers, there's no way that we can continue to progress the way we need to. And without great teachers, we are not going to have a great workforce. So we see this as integrally part of ensuring a viable economy in the South and throughout the country. So when we talk about this, we talk about it in terms of the South, but obviously we also talk about it in terms of it being a national issue. So we are so excited to be a part of this work. We're so excited to have partners like the ones you're going to hear from shortly. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Tom Talk from Future Ed. He's going to be our expert moderator for the day and really get into the nitty-gritty of all of this work. So Tom, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Really appreciate it. It's certainly a pleasure to co-host today's event with SREB and EducationCounsel. We also have a great panel to help us explore the teacher shortage landscape. As Stephen mentioned, Megan Boren is with SREB, where she works with states on teacher workforce issues. Tequilla Brownie is Executive Vice President for Strategy, Policy, and Community Coalitions at TNTP, where she has worked extensively on teacher recruitment. Sandi Jacobs is a principal at EducationCounsel. She's also the former policy director at the National Council on Teacher Equality and co-author of a new EducationCounsel Future Ed report on teacher shortages. And Nancy Wright is the director of instructional talent acquisition and retention at the District of Columbia Public Schools, a district that many of you may know has a state-of-the-art teacher hiring system. Also, Tomberlin is scheduled to be with us, had a bit of a schedule snag. Hopefully he'll be able to join us shortly. Tom is Director of Educator Recruitment and Support at the North Carolina State Department of Public Instruction, where, as his title suggests, he oversees teacher shortage policy, teacher recruitment, teacher pipeline policy at the state level there. So we'll use about half an hour of our hour for a panel discussion, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Please write your questions in the chat tab on your screens, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Megan, let me start with you. Your work with many states to improve their teacher workforces has given you a variety of I think, important insights that you've shared with us. What does the teacher shortage landscape look like from your perspective currently?
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. And Want to give a shout out to all the panelists here today. I'm excited about this conversation. And we're talking about teacher shortages. I think it's really important to understand examining what kind of teacher shortage problem we have, how severe it really is, and what's really caused it. And this is part of a major part of our work at SREB, is to help states, state leaders, district leaders, and higher ed leaders to really understand the full scope of each of those questions. So when we're looking at what we know and what we don't know about the teacher shortage, one thing that I'd like to make clear, and I think others will touch on this subject today, is we have some clear data in some aspects as to the shortage, and in other aspects we do not have very clear data, so more investigation is needed. But some things that we really do know is that the shortage is pretty scary across the whole country, especially in certain pockets and certain places, and it's growing, and it's been growing for over a decade. Especially when you're looking at the Southeast, which of course is where SREB really focuses our work on, the shortage is affecting each and every single one of our 16 member states. And it's affecting them in different ways in different regions of our states, within our states, excuse me. If you're looking at the shortage with regard to quantity of teachers, we can see some very clear data that there are growing shortages of teachers in certain subjects and certain grade levels. Within our 16 states, we know that we're seeing shortages of math teachers, science teachers, and special education teachers in all of our 16 states. We're also seeing an increase in shortages of world language teachers. About 3/4 of our states are also experiencing shortages in career and technical education teachers. And we're also starting now to see shortages in English language arts, as well as elementary education teachers in many of our states. You also see that these shortages are, as so much research has shown over the last several years, these shortages are more severe in high poverty districts, or there's hard to staff districts, depending on how you define those things. We're also seeing shortages in diversity, of course. We still have across the board, teachers are 80% white and 80% female when you're looking at our states. The diversity ranges in their SREB states from only 3% teachers of color in West Virginia to areas in our regions such as Texas and Florida, and they have up to 40% teachers of color, which are a little bit better, but still that diversity is a big piece. We're also seeing shortages in certified staff. More and more districts are telling us that they have increased numbers of uncertified teachers, emergency certified teachers, and long-term subs. We have shortages, severe shortages in some places of alternative and traditionally prepared teachers coming out of our EPP programs. Some of our 15 out of our 16 states have actually seen severe shortages over the last 8 years in this, and this ranges from a few hundred fewer teachers being prepared to in a couple of our states, thousands of teachers, fewer teachers being prepared over the last 8 years. And then we of course have severe quality shortages. We're seeing the number of inexperienced teachers going up in many of our states and most of our districts. And then we also have been interviewing a lot of teachers, principals, and district leaders over the last few years, and we're finding that nearly every single one of our districts and every single one of our states are telling us that they have fewer applicants for positions that are open, and many times they're not able to even hire anyone who's actually qualified for the position because those applicant numbers are going down. And lastly, I would like to just say it's really important to understand why we have these shortages. And I know we'll talk about this some more today, but the shortage causes are many. Some folks think that there's one or two causes, or that COVID is exacerbating the issue. And the issue before that was only in certain pockets to really worry about, but that's not That's not what the data is truly telling us when we drill down. The causes are many, from teacher pay, not enough support, inappropriate barriers into the profession, low career advancement, low career autonomy for teachers, a lack of incentives, a lack of teacher leadership roles, a lack of support from colleagues and administrators. The list goes on. So I think I'll stop there for the start of our conversation. We can continue to drill down.
Well, thank you, Megan. That was a very uplifting presentation. I really appreciate it. Sandi, what should policymakers and practitioners keep in mind in thinking about shortages? Megan's laid out a truly relatively bleak picture, and certainly she implied that there's much about the profession that is problematic, that is discouraging people from entering teaching. But what are some of the sort of touch points that you think people should keep in mind as they think about shortages?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So first and foremost is that we really need a close, careful analysis of the data. And we need it across states, aggregated at states level, but also specifically looking at districts. The teacher pipeline, we tend to think about recruitment and we tend to think about retention, but there are multiple points in the pipeline, and it's always been a leaky pipeline, right? People who enter preparation programs, a significant percentage don't exit. Of people who finish their preparation, not everybody gets certified. Of people who get certified, not everybody goes on to actually teach in a position, and we certainly know of teachers who begin teaching, not everybody stays in the classroom. And so really understanding both what that full pipeline looks like, but also understanding what's changing, right? Maybe the points in a certain pipeline, the leakiest spots are starting to change. And so we've had a tendency to talk about shortages as just this idea that we need more teachers, when, as Megan said, we need certain kinds of teachers in certain places with certain skill sets, and we certainly need more diversity in our teacher workforce. And the policy solutions and the programs that we start to look at those things aren't necessarily going to produce the teachers we need in the places that we need them without really understanding that data and how it's changing, particularly given the impact of the pandemic. There's also a difference between perception and what data shows. It may be that it is a lot harder to hire than it was a few years ago, but what is the data actually telling you about applicants and who ultimately gets placed? And again, while we need states very much to be involved in this, and that aggregated data at the state level is so important, we also need to look at differences across districts and especially, what is changing in that for certain districts at certain times.
Yeah, thanks, Sandi. So you talk about, you've written about some of the unintended consequences of viewing shortages as a generic rather than a targeted problem. What's an example of that and of that misalignment, and what are the consequences of it?
Yeah, I think that many states have had tuition assistance and loan forgiveness programs in place for a long time, and typically they end up with more second grade teachers and more social studies teachers, and not necessarily more special educators or more STEM teachers. So we have to target the solutions to the teachers that we actually need. And we also have to think about the what I've called the compound effects, right? So there are places that have geographic shortages, there are places that have subject area shortages, there are places that have diversity shortages, and there are places that are dealing with all three simultaneously. And if we, for example, have an initiative that's designed to produce more STEM teachers in a state through tuition assistance, maybe a salary differential, but we're not also taking into account that our highest need schools and districts are going to have an even harder time hiring those teachers. We're going to help the more affluent districts get more STEM teachers at the expense of the higher need districts. So we really have to think about the equity implications, which I think can lead to a lot of unintended consequences that widen rather than narrow equity gaps.
Great, thanks. Tequilla, what insights into teacher shortages have you and your TNTP colleagues gained from the work that you've done for now a number of years all across the country?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that, to be clear, totally agree with the other panels. This is not a new problem. What is different now is that it is exacerbated, is what we're hearing and seeing on the ground. So we've obviously studied, teacher recruitment and teacher retention for decades, as you say. And so as we think about the notion of improving the recruitment side, one of the key things you've got to focus on is building a pool. And so our best practices tell us you've got to hire earlier and do all those things, before the spring. And so we've worked with districts to start doing that, earlier, much earlier in the, early in the fall leading into spring. But what we're finding is that the pool is harder and harder to build. And a couple of things we know are attributing to that. I mean, anecdotally, we do know that colleges of education are seeing decreasing numbers of folks entering their program, as Sandi said, and then obviously decreasing numbers of folks also graduating, totally exacerbated by COVID, but not completely attributed to COVID. One of the other things I would say we're seeing is, as we've worked with districts and communities to think about broadening that pool, because we're trying to figure out, is it that more teachers are leaving that are being backfilled into the pipeline, or is it that the same levels of teachers are leaving, but the pool is not keeping up with the pace of the attrition? And so we're working with, a number of places to actually study and look at that. One of the things that was interesting, 2 points that I'll say about the recruitment side, during COVID, several states actually instituted waivers around, licensure and certification requirements. What we're trying to see is a couple of things. One is, did that actually help at all as far as the quantity, but more importantly, did it help with both the quality and the diversity in tandem? I mean, to be clear, we don't separate the two. We think an effective teacher, an effective pool is both high quality and very diverse. We've studied the diversity with our educator prep programs. And again, I mean, as Sandi and Megan both alluded to, the gap, what we actually call the diversity gap, is pretty broad between the number of diverse students and the number of diverse teachers, and it's not getting any better. When you look at that across the country, there are certainly some states where that gap is wider, but there are also many states that are starting to decrease the gap, but I would say very few are where they need to be as far as increasing the diversity. And the reason I mention that is it's almost like a pool sort of right there. If we focus on the diversity issue, it could be one key lever to actually helping with the shortage problem overall. So we're really interested in looking at that. And then on the flip side, I don't want to minimize the retention piece, because that one's really important. Many of you are familiar with, we wrote the Irreplaceables in 2012 that was focused on, teacher retention. And I would say that the difference now is not that much different from what it was before. We found then, about 74% of teacher attrition is what we call preventable, meaning, as Megan and Sandi said, teachers aren't getting the type of supports and the things that they need to actually want to stay in the field. So if we're seeing that level of preventable attrition, it suggests that the culture is not shifting, right? And so as you get more teachers coming in, we're not doing a good enough job to convince current teachers to stay, let alone those new teachers coming in to stay as well. So you're going to continue to get that bleeding pipeline. But the last thing I'll say is we're really working deeply in a few states right now, particularly within the SREB region. One is Arkansas. I actually happen to be based in Arkansas as well. It's my home state. So I know we're going deep in that state. And one thing, an unintended consequence, I would say, of some of the recent policy legislation that has been passed in Arkansas to allow districts to basically hire waiver teachers, to bring them in. They're helpful in the fact that they're bringing in more teachers. The problem is helping us bring in more uncertified teachers. And we're seeing a disproportionate number of unlicensed teachers, particularly in some of our poorer areas of the state and with students of color. So it's just exacerbating some of the equity challenges that we've been seeing for decades.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So how is TNTP thinking about the tension between qualified and certified? There have been a number of studies that suggest that just because a teacher is certified doesn't mean they're a particularly good teacher.
And that has not changed for us. I mean, we absolutely think that effectiveness is the true bar, and you measure that based on how well a teacher is helping students on their outcomes. But the minimal bar of even thinking about licensure, we do think it is important. It is not a proxy for effectiveness, but it is alarming that states that are actually bringing in waiver teachers aren't doing anything either on the licensure side or the performance-based effectiveness side to ensure that we're getting, teachers that are appropriately, adequately ready to help our students, succeed against the standards.
Great, thanks. Fortunately, Tom has been able to join us. Welcome, Tom. You're a state official, which is a really important perspective to bring to this conversation. So how are you and your colleagues in the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction thinking about shortages? Tequilla just offered, I think, a really valuable insight, which is that, in effect, we need to think about the shortage issue across the continuum, the human capital continuum, not just at the front end of it. But how are you and your colleagues thinking about the issue at the state level?
So one of the things we do in North Carolina and have done for a number of years is we monitor the what we call the state of the teaching profession, and we're looking at how teachers exit from the profession in North Carolina, and we collect reasons for why they're leaving. So some of those reasons are policy relevant, as Tequilla pointed out. Most of them are preventable, and so we work to try to find ways that policy can ameliorate that situation where it's possible. What we do know about attrition in North Carolina is it's very stable. So we don't see flight from the profession. It's more on the front end of an avoidance of entering the profession that seems to be affecting. We don't see this mass exodus from teaching that I think a lot of us have heard about. But in regard to that, we're looking at things that have been brought up by other folks here, and that is the leaky pipeline between our ed prep programs and employment in our districts. We know in the state of North Carolina that 50% of the teachers who are admitted to an ed prep program wind up teaching in the state within the 3 years of completing that program. So that's a lot of teachers left on the table, as it were. And what can we do to try to secure that pipeline? The other thing that we struggle with in North Carolina is defining what the appropriate demand is. So we can do things like look at what are the state funded positions that are allotted to our schools. Is that the right number? Is it what the districts need in order to provide a sound and basic education for all our students? And the answer is somewhere between, and then if schools had unlimited resources, what kind of staffing would they hire? So the answer has to be somewhere in the middle of that. And that's really tough to try to nail down as the right answer for teacher demand and how that relates to supply. We are doing a lot of work with advertising our North Carolina positions across the country. And this is not only just to bring in more teachers into the pipeline, but also an attempt to address the diversity issue. If we can cast a wider net than what our EPPs in North Carolina are able to produce in terms of a diverse teaching population, we think that could be really helpful. And I think that's pretty much how we're responding there. Oh, the effectiveness issue, I think was really important. North Carolina is really working now on shifting our licensure process away from a credentialing model to an effectiveness model. And really using, even if we continue to use proxies, also allowing for effectiveness to allow the teacher to be credentialed rather than simply using the passing of a test. Is the teacher doing great things with kids and that we can measure? And if so, using that to license teachers. Also on the issue of, we do recognize that perhaps the profession itself is unattractive. And so we're trying to build in compensation systems into an authentic career pathway within the teaching profession that would allow teachers to advance based on demonstrated skill and proven effectiveness with our students. And so creating an actual career pathway within the profession rather than just having a flat 30-year kind of expanse.
The District of Columbia Public Schools is doing very much the same. And I want to get to that, get to you, Nancy, and so you can describe that. But I have a couple of real quick follow-ups for you, Tom. You had mentioned the other day when we were talking that the inflow of teachers into North Carolina is very different now than it was some years ago, in that there are, as a percentage, traditional teachers, traditionally trained teachers from ed schools represent a much smaller percentage. Can you just sort of lay that out for everybody just quickly, the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3?
Right, so yes, we used to have a situation where our traditional programs provided probably upwards of 70% of our teachers that were hired in the state. And in recent years, we've found that number has shifted. The third, and a third that we're talking about is now a third of our teachers are supplied through our traditional educator prep programs, a third through some kind of alternate certification route. So these are folks who have gained a bachelor's degree in, a straight bachelor's degree, and then return to our EPPs for training while they're teaching. And then finally, a third are from out of state, teachers that are moving to North Carolina from out of state. And so that is a real shift in how the pipeline is configured. And that puts a lot of pressure on our HR departments to across the state to find access to out of state sources for teachers. And those are generally in states that overproduce teachers. From our perspective, we don't know how they feel about it, but from our perspective, those are states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, where we try to find those kinds of.
Interesting. And then secondly, how do you scale this, your very intriguing new strategy to move from credentialism to effectiveness as the key metric for hiring people? I mean, it assumes that you have a rigorous, reliable, valid system for judging effectiveness, but how do you do that at scale? How do you do that across an entire state?
So that is the challenge. And just to clarify, this is not about employment, this is about licensure. Right. So using those impact or those competencies, we're examining things like micro-credentialing to see if we can measure teachers' performance in an authentic setting with their students. We're looking at things we've traditionally used, student growth models to see if the students are in fact growing and contribute that back to a teacher's influence. And then we're looking at a more 360 approach to evaluating teachers. We know, can we get more information on how teachers are working with their students? Right now we have principal observation, but can we expand that out to peer observation or even student observation of teaching performance to try to eliminate some of the bias and some of those other measures?
Interesting. Right. Thanks. Nancy, DCPS has 50,000 students. You have, as a district, over the past 12, 13 years, made really significant progress in hiring strong candidates retaining good teachers, and reducing shortages. Tell us a bit about your magic.
Yeah, of course. I think in terms of hiring strong candidates, a huge piece of this is that we've designed a centralized screening process that is predictive of future performance on impact, which is our teacher feedback and evaluation system. And that's something we've been working on for about the last 10 years in particular. And this has just played a critical role in ensuring that we're hiring the right people from the start. We've also put a lot of focus on early hiring based on what we know about the relationship between teacher effectiveness and time of hire. And at DCPS, school leaders make their own hiring decisions for their school communities. So essentially, that means we've really focused on supporting school leaders to be prepared to hire as early as possible, even when they're juggling multiple competing priorities in the middle of the school year. Really thinking through like, what does it mean to build out resources to support school leaders? And then I think in terms of preventing shortages, obviously, as a few folks have already alluded to, strategic retention is a huge piece of that. And additionally, we've been focusing on long-term solutions through different strategic partnerships for content areas where we see those shortages, specifically here in DCPS. So like really at large, we're making major investments in our teacher pipeline work. For example, we've established pipeline program partnerships with organizations like Urban Teachers, where every participant is dual certified in special education. We just recently established a new partnership residency program with Georgetown University for future dual language and ESL educators. So, really thinking about strategic partnerships from the lens of like where we're seeing the need within our schools. And then I think the last thing I'll sort of briefly mention is, I know Sandi mentioned the unintended equity issues when it comes to staffing practices. And we've been thinking about specifically how to get and keep our best educators in our schools where they're needed most. And one strategy that we've been using at DCPS is to do that through performance-based compensation bonuses and signing bonuses for staff at our highest need schools and for staff in our highest need content areas.
Yeah, and just to fill in a little bit there, thank you, Nancy. Those bonuses can be up to $25,000 a year, right? So it's significant money. And when you talk about strategic retention, what you're talking about is working hard to maintain your highest rated teachers, your highly effective teachers, which you've been able in recent years to retain 95, 96% on a year-over-year basis, as opposed to your minimally or ineffective rated teachers who you actually encourage to leave in different ways, right? So it is a very different model that is quite proactive and is designed to focus on quality. I mean, one advantage you have, right, is that the District of Columbia is a bit of a millennial magnet. You have a very big supply of replacement teachers you can draw on, whereas some rural districts, say, might not have that luxury. But so tell us also a little bit about how you support schools in hiring early in the annual process, which really starts with incentivizing teachers who are leaving to let you know that early.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, ensuring that we're prepared centrally means that we're supporting schools to be prepared to make those hiring decisions. And like you mentioned, sort of the first step of that is encouraging teachers to tell us before April 1st if they won't be returning for the upcoming school year. And if they do let us know before the April 1 deadline, they'll receive $1,000 bonus. And that just really allows us to know those vacancies as early as possible to fill them as soon as we can. That's a big piece of it. And then I think, ensuring as we think about like, what is the process at each school? How are they having stay conversations with the teachers that they want to absolutely retain? What does it mean for us to be supporting teachers who want to transfer so we don't lose them from the agency at large? Is all a piece of that early hiring conversation.
Great. Thank you very much. We have about 30 questions in the chat, so I want to get to as many of those as we can. Obviously, we won't be able to get to all of them on in this discussion. But first, I want to just come back to you quickly, Tequilla, and have you talk in a little bit more detail about the work TNTP and some other organizations are doing to address the shortage of teachers of color. Give us some very concrete things that you have seen to move the needle there.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, as you think about the recruitment side and building the pool, as we've looked at, when we look at the research around the tangential support roles like support, substitute teachers, paraprofessionals, et cetera, though it's interesting that those teachers are way more diverse and their retention numbers are higher. And so we're actually looking to help districts leverage those pools to think about, this wider pool towards a strategy that's going to yield teachers that are more likely to reflect the diversity of the student population, which actually helps with retention, right? Because these are potential candidates that are familiar with the students, familiar with the communities, and they don't get some of the culture shock, frankly, that we see happen with some folks that come from outside of the communities that they're going to be placed in. One of the other, I would say, very specific things we're thinking about on the retention side, and we've been working with a few places there, is to think about placing teachers of color in a position that sets them up for success. There's a lot of research out now about sort of some of this burden that teachers of color carry by just, reference of them being teachers of color. And what we're seeing is that those districts and states that are focused on more of a sort of cohort approach, and we learn this about regular teachers, right? When you look at the studies from other places that said, oh, let's recruit our most effective teachers and put them in the highest need schools. When you do that alone, they don't stay, right? When you send them as one. So we learned that, and I don't know why we don't think automatically to apply that when we think about teachers of color, but that is certainly one thing to think about, placing them in sort of a cohort model so they're not as one person going into a school environment that may not feel as welcoming to them. There's been some research, not even just from TNTP, but one even recently from Teach Plus that says, if you listen, we will stay. I think Ed Trust and Teach Plus actually co-authored it, and they talk a lot about some of the contexts and conditions that teachers of color face when they go into school. And so creating those supportive conditions is absolutely one of the things we'll do that needs to be done. The final thing I'll say is we're actually leading, along with the Hunt Institute, a coalition around building a pool. We actually have set a tangible goal called Million Teachers of Color. And basically it's looking at the fact that by our calculations, in order to close that diversity gap that I mentioned between students and teachers, we need literally 1 million new teachers of color in the next 10 years to help us close that gap. And so some of the levers we're working on to do that are obviously helping to incentivize states and districts to prioritize that. We've pushed for the Biden administration to prioritize that. And we've heard Secretary Cardona now state it as a goal and a priority of the administration. Now what we're pushing for is the funding support to resource that so that it's not just an unfunded mandate. Some of the concrete things that we're advocating for in that work are absolutely supporting more institutions that are providing more teachers of color. And by that, obviously HBCUs and predominantly minority serving institutions fall into that category. They're not the only ones. I want to be clear, when you look at where candidates come from, our HBCUs and predominantly minority institutions still provide, a significant number of teachers of color, but by no means are they at the scale to solve the problem. And so we're looking for resources at the higher ed level that incentivize candidates to go into the profession. One thing I will say, we've actually studied on some campuses of predominantly minority serving institutions and HBCUs, and we found that students on campus don't even know that education is a major. The tangible example, Xavier, one of the preeminent, as we know, HBCUs in getting especially candidates of color accepted into medical school on par with the Ivy Leagues. on that campus, when we went and talked to students at the freshman and sophomore level, which is why our research tells us they're more likely to consider education as a major versus waiting until the senior year, getting to those candidates earlier has to be also a part of our strategy. And then on the other side, states working with districts to support them and help them with strategies, not just an unfunded mandate, but to really prioritize educator diversity.
Really helpful. Thank you. Megan, here, I'm going to shift to audience questions and get to as many as we possibly can. Megan, maybe you could take this one, and Tom, perhaps you have thoughts too. Dan Goldhaber asks, is there evidence that states and districts are moving towards differentiated financial incentives to address the particularly acute shortages in foreign languages, math, science, et cetera?
Yes, there's actually a lot of evidence of states and districts in particular taking an approach of differentiated pay, particularly bonuses for different things. I'll let Tom talk about North Carolina, as they are trying to work on a plan that will offer a different compensation structure statewide. But a couple of other states are following North Carolina's footsteps. So I will say, though, that differentiated pay, typically, right now, the trends we're seeing are on providing bonuses for career and technical education or STEM fields. Both of those are very popular right now in order to get more math, science, and CTE teachers.
So is that a bonus to go into teacher training in those areas, or to teach a bonus, salary bonus for teachers who train in those areas and take jobs in classrooms?
We are seeing both, actually. We're seeing bonuses on the hiring end. We're also seeing not necessarily bonuses as much, but loan forgiveness programs for certain subject matters. Also, of course, there are many loan forgiveness programs for getting more teachers into high poverty districts or very rural districts. And several districts, programs are emerging as well on that front and trying to offer extra pay to teachers who will come to those harder to serve areas. But I will say, just as my last point before Tom mentions their piece in North Carolina, is that we aren't seeing in the data that these strategies, especially one-off bonuses for particular teacher subjects or teachers in certain areas, are actually making a big chip at the shortage problem. They're just sort of, working around the edges, so to speak. We aren't seeing that those strategies are making as big of a dent, I think, as many would like, especially policymakers.
Is that the case in North Carolina, Tom?
So North Carolina has a program that advances teachers on the salary schedule when they come out of their preparation programs in certain, if they score a certain score on the pedagogy assessment that we have, which is generally the EdTPA or the PPAT, those teachers can advance on the salary schedule up to 3 years, depending on what kind of work they're doing. So our EC teachers advance on that scale, and then STEM teachers advance on the scale even further. The program is pretty nascent, so we don't have any data to suggest that it's having the impact that we would like to see. I do agree with you that incentives on the preparation side might be better. Getting people in those programs by the time they're done with their program and realize that they can advance, it's maybe a little too late. But I like the idea of incentives working with the labor market. I'm not sure how we would do that at scale in the state, but it is an interesting question.
Hey, Tom, can I add one thing on that?
Please.
We've had a lot of research over the year. This gets back to what Tequilla was saying about cohorts, where we can bonuses are somewhat effective as a recruitment strategy. They are not effective as a retention strategy because teachers want to be in a building with other teachers who want to be there, and they want to work with supportive leaders and, you know, all those things that go together. I think we've also seen in survey after survey, right, the idea of bonuses isn't very appealing to teachers. They know they're here today, gone tomorrow, right? The legislature gave us the money this year, they might not next year. I can't put that I'm expecting to get a bonus on my mortgage application. So I think, you know, everything Megan and Tom and what Tequilla were saying, it's like this whole rethink we have to do around pay and how we assign teachers, that's going to lift up the profession, and not sort of these little one-off attempts. These band-aids aren't going to move us forward.
Nancy, I'd love to get your perspective on this question, since DCPS does invest a good deal of money into retaining its highly effective teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, we're providing bonuses differentiated based on the type of school the teacher is working at. So we definitely see, and I've heard based on feedback, we just recently did a 10-year review of our teacher evaluation system, that the Impact Plus bonuses do have an impact on retention of teachers, particularly at those high need schools. And I think we also see it as it supports us in getting our best educators in those schools as well. So it is effective, at least at DCPS's perspective, as both a recruitment and a retention strategy to keep folks in those schools.
Yeah, but again, it's important to note that those bonuses are substantial, and Tom raises a valuable question, I think, in asking, you know, whether we have the resources to do that across districts with very varying resources in an entire state. I mean, it's it's a challenge. However, you can differentiate pay off of any base, right? You don't have to be a wealthy district to have differentiated compensation. There are a couple of questions that go to some of the other challenges that teachers face, and the extent to which those challenges might be influencing people's decision to go into the profession and stay there. In particular, one person asks, is there any research on the impact of policies such as gun control on admission to teacher training programs or teacher recruitment? And they mentioned Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, the shooting there, and the debate that raised about whether teachers should carry guns, and whether those sort of non-instructional issues are influencing teaching today. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I mean, I'll jump in to say we don't know. I mean, and that's just the candid truth, even related to COVID. We know that, as Sandi mentioned, the problem with the teacher shortage issue is not new. It has been here for a while. It has not gotten better. You know, there were predictions that, you know, COVID would drive massive, you know, exits from the profession. And, you know, initially we weren't seeing, you know, massive exits. And even now, I mean, we're seeing exits, but it's not clear that, you know, exits are increased as a direct result of COVID itself or any type of, you know, mandates or policies. We absolutely need to study that, but that's one of the things that from TNTP's perspective, I would say that we're researching, but we don't yet know.
Okay, thanks. Others? Thoughts on that?
I'll just add, I think a lot of qualitative data tells us that things like this are chipping away at kind of the respect of the profession and the desirability of the profession. Really, solutions to the teacher shortage issue, all the solutions that have been posed today are all very valid, and they will contribute to lessening the shortage. But ultimately, we really have to look at elevating the profession overall. And instances like those, you know, kind of indirect policy implications, you know, policy changes that are, and policy debates that are really chipping away at the respect of the profession, the idea that this has career advancement, there's agency and autonomy for those within teaching. those are pieces that as a society, you know, culturally, you know, overall, they're really affecting the desirability of teaching and the desire for those who are already in the profession to feel like they should stay in it versus finding something else to do where they will not have, you know, all of this noise, all of these extra stressors and problems.
All right, fair enough. So,
Tom, if I can highlight one comment in the chat, sort of building on that, Lisa Kugel
Sure.
mentioned the notion of not connecting education and seeing it as a broader workforce issue. And I think, you know, we heard that at the opening. The one comment I'd like to make relates, I mean, we see it as a very tangible thing playing out when there is a teacher shortage. The person that's on the news trying to defend themselves is the superintendent. The Workforce Development Board is not on the news and held accountable. The local mayor, elected officials. It is literally seen as a narrow K-12 issue versus, as Lisa indicated in her comment and question, will comment that when, you know, other manufacturing, again, in my area, big welding company opens up or, you know, steel mill opens up, all hands are on deck to make sure there is a viable trained workforce. There are pathways and innovative pathways to get people quickly certified as welders, as electricians. I'm not saying you can, you know, make that is that simple to get a teacher trained, but the fact that resources and prioritization is collectively there from all the key actors and key players versus the K-12 sector on its own trying to solve this instead of seeing it as a workforce issue. I think one of the ways that we can begin to combat that is as we present this as, yes, a broader workforce issue, but especially the impact that it has related to we've all heard, most of us have heard about 2Gen strategies. If we build a pool directly from the communities that our students are coming from, the potential to have an impact for our students as a 2Gen strategy, meaning we're lifting the wages of the very families and parents and caregivers of our students, while at the same time, hopefully building a broader, more diverse and effective pool that may help us begin to prioritize this as a community versus just a K-12 issue where only the superintendent is accountable.
fair enough. Are there other strategies that we haven't talked about for addressing different aspects of the teacher shortage challenge? Sandi, you laid out a number in your report.
Yeah, so just two off the top of my head, one that I think picks up with what Tequilla was just saying. One is also thinking about CTE programs that get our secondary students not only thinking about education as a career, but beginning to take some of the course that they might need, right? That gives them a leg up as they prepare for their post-secondary programs. And then related to that, I think, you know, we put a lot of emphasis on recruitment and what programs are doing to attract participants. But we also need to look at the content of those and the structure of the programs themselves. Where is the time being spent? Is it spent in ways that are appealing to students and that are going to give them the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in school? You know, is there enough focus on clinical training? Is there clinical training that gives them exposure to rural communities and urban communities? And we noted in the report, New York State requires every teacher, regardless of the certification they're seeking, to have a practicum experience with a special education population, right? So maybe people who aren't thinking about a pathway in special ed pursue that after they have that exposure. So taking the look at the structure and design of programs themselves, you know, we see a lot of places where people can't finish in 4 years, right? And then there's a cost burden for what is not going to be a high wage profession of the program itself. So I'll stop there. I know others probably have thoughts too, but looking at preparation, I think, is really important.
What's your take on that? on the teacher prep sort of piece of this?
So, I mean, I think our teacher prep programs, one, by and large, do just a fantastic job. And to address one of the comments earlier, we find in North Carolina that on average, our traditionally prepared teachers are our most effective and most persistent in the profession of any of our pipelines.
Mhm.
And so that's really important to us, to maintaining that kind of traditional program, but we do want to see them being more responsive to the market demands. And that creates an interesting dilemma for this at a state level. How do you get big institutions like the state teacher market to inform the recruitment at an EPP? And how do you do that in a way that has impact in a timely manner? So that's really tough. One thing I do want to comment about is the kind of reaching back into the public education system itself to build teachers, which I think is a really promising idea. And the synchronicity of this is not lost on me, that, you know, most of us have realized at this point in our lives that the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so how can we leverage that with our students, helping them become teachers that will give us a dual benefit of exposing them to the joys of teaching, as well as improving their own acquisition of the content. And I think that has real promise and merit. It's a little out of my realm, but it does seem to be a really interesting idea.
Great, thanks. Nancy, you were going to jump in. Go ahead.
I just dropped it in the chat. I was just saying, like, to build off Sandi and Tequilla, like we are DCPS are trying to do this in real time, where DCPS high school students can, this is through a partnership with American University, where DCPS high school students can take dual enrollment courses as seniors. And then also, so that's the sort of one prong of it. And the second prong is that DC high school graduates can receive a full ride to undergrad to be in the ed school if they commit to teaching in DCPS school for 5 years. So in that program, they would do all of their practicum and student teaching in a DCPS school, and then continue to receive coaching and development from AU staff during their 5-year teaching commitment. So we're really excited and hopeful to see sort of what that could look like long-term for our shortage solution, or one of our solutions.
Great. By the way, it's probably worth noting that DCPS has a teaching force made up of 15% of Black men, which is 3 times the national average. How did that happen, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this is something we've been working really hard on over the last 10 years to make sure our teacher workforce is representative of our student population. And we certainly have more room to grow, but I think specific to the male educators of color, really thinking through strategic recruitment, where are we recruiting, what universities are we partnering with? And then also, again, I feel like I'm beating the dead horse of strategic partnerships here, but we've established a residency program with Howard University that's focused on male educators of color. So really thinking through like short-term recruitment strategies around male educators of color, but also long-term solutions with that as well. And then I think, again, thinking through who are, you know, current staff, whether in those support roles that we can move into teacher preparation programs to become lead teachers has been a big piece of that as well.
Great, thank you. So we're almost out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question of the panelists. So there have been a number of comments and questions in the chat about the sort of standing of teaching as an occupation in the country, the perception of teaching, and the fact that many think that it is not a high status way to spend one's career. Teacher unions have played a very big role in the teaching professions for some time. Obviously, there's not collective bargaining in every state, but the organized teaching profession has worked very hard to focus on wages, hours, and working conditions, traditional sort of union prerogatives. Teaching is a unionized occupation in many places. Is that a plus or a minus on the question of status, standing, and the like?
So being a non-union state, I'll wade into this water. I think ultimately it is a detriment to the profession in that from my perspective, one of the key tenets of this is that all teachers are paid the same regardless of the effort, the effectiveness, the whatever criteria you want to establish, that we're paying all teachers the same. And I think that is in large part done a whole lot to diminish the profession in the eyes of the public.
The only sentence I'll say to that, there is a difference between equality and equity. And unfortunately, I would say my sense from many of our unions, contracts and labor things we see are focused on equality versus equity. And that's in both directions, thinking about the adults and the students.
Just explain that in a little bit more detail.
Well, just the simple fact that, I mean, all things are not created equal. And so I would say our unions are trying to ensure that everyone is treated equally, meaning the same, versus an equity-based approach, which means that there is nuance. You're trying to make sure that you're getting the best outcomes for your neediest people. And in the teaching profession, if you think about our neediest teachers, they're our highest performing teachers, right? They need to be recognized and rewarded better. And our lowest performing need to be supported. And if they can't improve, then supported to exit and find a different role. And we don't focus on that nuance. We want to treat the widget effect. We want to treat teachers as widgets, all equal.
Well, that may be a nice way to end. It certainly brings us back to the broader question of teacher shortages and how we address them. I want to thank all the panelists for really insightful conversation. Thank you for everybody in the audience who shared questions. Sorry for those who submitted questions we couldn't get to, but this is a really central topic to the future of public education, and I'm glad that we were able to partner with SREB and EdCounsel today in discussing some aspects of this really important issue. So thanks everyone, and those of you who are working to address the teacher shortage issues and improve the profession around the country. We're with you. Good luck. Thank you.